So let's welcome Jack.
How's the level? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Well, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it also helps me not have to look at note cards to have the pictures. One thing I noticed while Tanaya was talking is the relative lack of humor in my presentation, which is telling about the relative lack of humor in my life until about 8 years ago, thanks to a woman sitting in the front row here who gets me to laugh a lot. And we'll wrap up with that. So, what I'm going to describe, this is my daughter 26 years ago down in Costa Rica, and it's, to me, the epitome of wellness. And my life has been, and my work has been intertwined. The theme, looking back, is connection, and the relative lack of connection that I experienced in my early years, and my quest to create more connection and the tools to do that, and that's what you're going to see. Oh, have you started the video?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm recording this for hopefully posterity.
Or TEDx.
So, this statement, which I saw a few years ago, really resonated with me, particularly after seeing cultures where they're connected. And then about 10 years ago, I realized that these 6 words summarized my work. And also, I had believed that to teach what you need to learn, and it was no accident I'm doing wellness or I'm doing connection, because I needed it. And fortunately, it has paid off. Now, it all began in 1940 when this country doctor, surgeon in northwestern Ohio, who grew up in Missouri, and went to New York to visit his cousin and met a city girl. And they fell in love, rather quick courtship, and she moved back to Bluffton, Ohio. If you've ever read Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, that's their story. And here, if I can get the movie to play, it's been a little cranky. Yeah, I'm coming home from, oops, the... I was a redhead.
Isn't that amazing?
Just like him.
You had more hair there.
I did have more hair. So I'd spent 2 weeks at Bluffton Community Hospital in the nursery with the other screaming kids. There was a big boom going on. It actually made the newspaper. There were so many kids born that week. And I was on a 4-hour bottle schedule, and I screamed after 3 hours when I got hungry. And my mother told me later how much she hated it, but she had to follow the rules. And also I got circumcised, which was the norm in those days, which is 70% of your sensitive nerves removed, which has major consequences later on, and some work I've been doing and publishing articles towards ending it. So my early childhood, I had them all to myself for a while. I was the firstborn. That didn't last too long. I learned how to do tricks to get attention. I actually remembered that picture being taken. But in looking at my baby book, I saw a lot of unhappy pictures. There weren't too many smiling pictures. And it was the beginning of a lifelong issue with depression, which has been a major part of my work as well. Now, here, the 3 of us, we were born 2.5 years apart, the worst possible sibling timing. There's a whole book about why that's the worst timing. My sister came along and displaced me, and then my brother after that. And you can see we weren't a happy crew there. I bonded with my tricycle. And, but I would get questions from my dad's patients. They'd come to the house sometimes to see him. Are you going to be a doctor like your daddy when you grow up? And it wasn't too hard to figure out the right answer to that question. So I blindly, I remember looking at a chart of anatomy that he brought home and looking at the insides, and that's interesting. So I blindly proceeded towards that goal. I was a nerd. I didn't have any dates in high school. I had this is my science project. I got interested in electronics, and became an electrician. I wired a number of houses and a store, completed when I was in med school. Went to a small Midwestern college, Worcester in Ohio, and met a, quotes, girl my senior year. She was a sophomore, and we fell in love. She was the daughter of a medical school professor in the University of Alabama, and programmed to marry a doctor, and that's what I thought I was going to be. So we got married in the middle of my second year, and it was tough. They kept saying it would get better, and it didn't. I was in Boston, and a token Midwest wasp among a lot of cutthroat guys. So I came to San Francisco for my internship, Public Health Service Hospital. It's now a luxury condominium on the south side of the Presidio. And I was so depressed with the number of cancer patients that we couldn't talk about the fact they were dying. Kubler-Ross had not published Death and Dying. That I actually stood on the roof of the wing here and considered jumping off it, but it didn't look quite high enough to kill me, so I chickened out. And then was offered a residency in preventive medicine in Baltimore. It was either that or Vietnam, and at that point the choice was easy. And there I got invited to live in an intentional community of hippie-type folks and old-timers as well. It was an amazing experience, and it was there that my daughter was born. We I knew I wasn't ready to be a father, but it was that or divorce, and in the 70s in my family, divorce wasn't an option, so I reluctantly went along with it. It was wonderful with her, but our relationship suffered a lot. This led to my present work of having children destroys most marriages in nuclear families, because we need a village to raise kids. So we got into intense therapy, worked on ourselves for 2.5 years, and it was wonderful in terms of our own growth, but we concluded at the end of that we just couldn't live together. So we separated. This picture is kind of telling of me with my mom and brother there on the left, and the gap between me and my wife and unhappy looking daughter. So she was 2.5 when we separated, and I, according to the plan, was coming back to California to start the wellness center. And she elected to stay in Baltimore and get a master's in social work. So we were separated by 3,000 miles, and that was the hardest decision of my life. Meanwhile, while this was going on, I'm learning that I can't prescribe drugs. It was just too painful to mask symptoms, and I started prescribing things like the Angry Book and lowering blood pressure as a result. So masking symptoms of drugs just wasn't working for me, and this preventive medicine residency was providing some tools on that, but it wasn't until I stumbled on this book on the clearance table at the Hopkins Medical Bookstore, marked down to $2 from $2.95. I thought wellness was a silly word, but he had a mental, emotional, and spiritual dimension to health. This was a guy who started the U.S. Department of Vital Statistics and ran it for 25 years. Amazing man. I get teary thinking about it. And I lived 20 miles from him for a couple of years and never thought to go see him. I didn't think it was going to amount to much. But when I learned about him later, he was truly amazing. So out of that, I developed an illness wellness continuum. You can see the early version up there done on a typewriter with press-on letters, and then I got a graphic artist to improve it, and now it's in color, and it's being reprinted in textbooks and nursing texts and so forth, and it's gotten quite a bit of notoriety. This led to my starting the Wellness Center in Mill Valley in '75, in this converted residence in downtown Mill Valley and Miller Avenue. And Tainaya's story about the redwood, the siding inside, its vertical tongue and groove, had been layered with paint, and my brother and I rented a sandblaster, and we blasted the walls of this room. It was a horrible experience. But it turned out really nice. You can't see how red it really is. I want to back up. You can see the hippie influence in 1975. Those are my neckties. I wove them into a piece called All Tied Up. And that's me in the center. This was a lifestyle evolution group. It was like a therapy group, but you didn't have to have a psychological diagnosis. You wanted to evolve your life. And it was a great experience. Here, 3 of our staff are hugging a client who was graduating. We were doing biofeedback and stress reduction and nutrition and fitness, personal image consulting. And I was having the time of my life. This was the first time I was actually doing something I wanted to do. I was 33 years old, and it was wonderful, except it wasn't paying the bills. We didn't take insurance because we weren't treating or diagnosing or prescribing, and so people had to pay for their services, and people are more willing to pay for their car preventive maintenance than they are themselves. We limped along for 4 years, got a lot of attention, got written up in the Pacific Sun. Steve McNamara came and became a client, and 30 years later they did a retrospective in the Sun. Got in Prevention magazine, at that point had 13 million subscribers, and my dad's patients were bringing this article in. He didn't even know what the magazine was. Got 1,000 letters, mainly from nurses wanting to know how they could get their doctors to get into wellness. And then this culminated in '79 when we were on 60 Minutes, and I've got to hold the mic up here so you can hear it, if it will play. No. Why isn't it playing?
Wellness. Now there's a word you don't hear every day. Noted for his work in this field, Dr. John Travis established a wellness program soon after finishing medical studies at Tufts and Johns Hopkins universities. Can you give me a definition of wellness?
It's recognizing that there's more to life than the absence of sickness. That health is simply not the absence of disease. It's an ongoing dynamic state of growth. Just because you aren't sick, you don't have any symptoms, and you could go get a checkup and get a clean bill of health, doesn't mean that you're well. It doesn't mean that you're going to prevent disease further down the line.
So that was '79, and we had just closed the center, so it didn't do us much good. I was burnt out. I had up to 13 staff at one point, and I was never meant to be a manager. I thought it was going to be a quiet little practice when I opened it. We had to spell wellness on the phone at that point.
Oh my gosh.
And his opening line is, wellness, there's a word you don't hear every day, and it was true. But it certainly caught on in the '80s, and it got cheapened. It got turned into alternative treatments as well. Simultaneously, I was working on the wellness workbook, which is now in the 4th edition, which is used primarily as a text, and it uses another form of 12 different kinds of connection. These are connections with the energy in your body, how we take it in, how we transform it, and how we return it to the environment, and there isn't time to go into any more than that, other than it can be measured into a what we call the wellness wheel, and then scored if you take a questionnaire, which I developed in 1975, the wellness inventory. I sold 50 of them the first year. Later on, we printed them in 10,000 at a time, and now it's an online version that's used in colleges and nursing schools, and even the Army, one of the branches using it. So I was burnt out at this point. I closed the center, and at our last seminar up at Ralston White Retreat, I met an Australian woman who we fell in love. We both had a desire for the simple life, and we looked both in Australia and Fiji and wound up in Costa Rica in the Monteverde Quaker community up in the mountains, where we bought 100 acres, and we tried to be self-sufficient. We found out it ain't that easy. We had a wonderful time. We tried to bring more people to the 100-acre farm that we had, but the El Salvadorian War was on, the Nicaraguan War, and so people thought it was a war zone and didn't come. So in the mid-'80s, with the peace movement going on in the States, I was encouraged to come back, and we started working with helping professionals. And one of the keys was this book, Shadow Dancing in the USA, which clued me into this phenomenon of shadow that Carl Jung talked about, and then Robert Bly wrote about later on. And the fact that owning our shadow allows us to be more connected. They're inversely proportional. And now Brene Brown is talking about vulnerability and shame and taking it to a whole new level. So we did this for a number of years, and then I stumbled on another book which caused me to change my career completely from adult wellness to infant wellness, because I realized that it's these first months of when hospitalized birth, even the most pregnancies are treated like a baby's treated like a lump, and they're sentient at 16 weeks. And when the fourth trimester, which is the next 9 months, are crucial. And carrying a baby, sleeping with them, nursing them on demand, all of these things. When I learned about attachment parenting, even though Marin and I had been together 12 years at that point and never intended to have another kid, I'm not going to do that again, we realized that maybe it would be different. And her biological alarm went off, and so at age 40, on the 40 acres that we bought up in Kamshi between Ukiah and Mendocino, and we were 7 miles from the grid. We were all solar. We had a water birth underwater with a midwife, and it was amazing. I converted an old shell into a livable space, but it began to take its toll again. I got depressed. I was feeling left out of the overwhelming demands of a baby. The same dynamic unfolded again, and we managed to hold it together, but it took a real toll on our relationship. We then moved to an intentional community in Virginia, which was wonderful for my daughter growing up. She had playmates. We were homeschooling. They'd go down to swim in the lake. They'd go to each other's houses, pretty much unsupervised. Whoever was at the house would take care of them. We had to figure out where they were. So here's my second daughter, born 21 years and 21 days after my first daughter. Simultaneously, my wife and Suzanne Arms, who wrote Immaculate Deception and started the natural birth movement in the 70s, a group of us started a nonprofit called the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children. And our work was to put together the optimal conditions for connection. And we've spent 10,000 hours putting together a blueprint and then researching it and publishing it. It's still unmatched on the web. And that was a lot of our work together. In 2000, we decided to move to Australia because we thought it was a better place to raise her. First living down in Victoria, which is very Victorian. It's a beautiful house. I put in the pool and extended the deck and turned the carport into a sunroom and got to do my building stuff. But it wasn't, I wanted to join a men's group, and they said, "Have you tried the Lions Club?" That was the best. That was the best I could do. So we moved up to Byron Bay area, Mullumbimby specifically, which is the Santa Cruz of Australia, where all the old hippies now live. They've gone there in the 70s. Amazing place. And our backyard overlooked this sacred mountain, and I managed to capture a picture of a rainbow coming out of the top of it. My daughter was interested in photography, was working for a wedding photographer, and who posed her for her website with these pictures. And she matured nicely. And her passion now is animal rights, and she was arrested and spent 6 hours in jail with 9 other people near Sydney back in March. They were fined $4,000 and put on probation, but then they appealed and it was overturned, fortunately. She's now in Europe doing actions there, and she's totally committed to exposing the horrors of what goes on in slaughterhouses. It's unbelievable. Meanwhile, back in Mill Valley, my older daughter has bred, and I have grandchildren. They're now a tween and a teen, but here are earlier pictures with them. And I've healed a lot of my estrangement from my first daughter through this connection. Some adult wellness stuff was still going on back in 2010. I got interviewed for this New York Times article. But at that point, we were researching and writing my experience from the first marriage, and it was unfolding with the second marriage or the second daughter, of how having children destroys relationships in nuclear families, and published this book. And now there's a website devoted to how to prepare people and how to work, how to educate coaches and therapists that are working with couples that are struggling and unprepared for the enormous work that having a baby in a nuclear family is. Meanwhile, I was living in an unintentional community. I've been mentioning that a lot of my desire for connection was met by living in communities. I lived in 5 intentional communities. I grew up in a small town that was like a community, and 2 unintentional communities. I'm at this point considering Marin Valley unintentional, but we're creating it. It wasn't created with that in mind. This one, unfortunately, blew up, and after 5 years, at this wonderful location on the eastern seaboard of Australia, ended. Now, what happened for me in 2011, when my daughter left home, and I was realizing I thought I was over the hill. I knew we were experiencing the empty nest syndrome, and just emotionally did not have much going. I wanted to improve my relationship with my wife, and just wasn't happening. So at a workshop in Harbin Hot Springs, I bet you know who. And it was amazing. At age 68, I could fall in love. It was, I called myself Jack 2.0 at that point. And our life has been amazing in the 8 years since then. She got me into mountain biking, and we have a lot of fun. We've traveled all over the world. It's our Halloween costume. And that's pretty much the story. This is my daughter in a bubble. I want to end with a plug, though, for one of my mentors, Susan Campbell, who her work has helped me immensely in getting more connected. We'll be speaking here next month, so be sure to check that out. And that is the story. So. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. You know, one thing kept coming up for me is a single mother who had to supply the money to support my children and all of that. I kept thinking to myself, how did you just suddenly get up and go to Australia? How did you suddenly get up and go to the East Coast? How did that all happen?
One of the things that I didn't mention is that once I left medicine, I learned about voluntary simplicity, particularly in Costa Rica. And I've lived below the poverty level, or the 3 of us did, since 1975. You can live very simply. There's actually a minimalist. I am a minimalist. There's a great video on Netflix about that. When we moved to Australia, we had some money that we had rolled into different houses. And we she had a sister there, and it was fairly simple and cheaper. So
So anyway, it all worked out. Is
Yeah,
what you're saying,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
we,
One way or another.
yeah. That's annoying. Yeah.
With your credentiality, with your knowledge, with all that you have to give in your regard to your expertise, had you ever thought of initiating a program of education in our lacking school system, where the teachers are relegated to bringing up the children because the parents are incapable or unwilling?
Wonderful idea, but I was barely able to make it on my own. Funding. So when I first had the idea for a wellness center, I went to the Park Lawn building, which is the Pentagon for the Public Health Service, and I pitched my idea, and they thought, great idea, but no money. So I did it on my own. I used my life insurance savings, and my dad lent me money, and I borrowed from my life insurance. But basically, it's funding. And Yvonne can tell you about raising kids as a retired school teacher. and I've had teachers approach me over the years and want to use to convert the wellness inventory to for kids, but it's, you know, the funding and the ideas are out there, but it's difficult. So, yeah.
Thank you for that beautiful presentation. It just strikes me as you've lived a life in alignment, following some very beautifully high ideals and having the intelligence to really make a difference. And I thank you.
Yeah, right on.
I'm curious what your cutting edge is now.
It continues to be the issue of shadow and my own shadow and how it manifested as depression for most of my life. At age 65, I undertook to reinvent myself, and I got involved in a psychodrama group and a co-counseling group. I worked with a counselor who turned me on to the Abraham Hicks work, and I learned that while I had been trained to find a problem and fix it or complain about it, you know, in medicine it's all about fixing problems. Gratitude was a new concept for me, and when I began appreciating instead of complaining, and I realized that behind every complaint is a commitment. Something isn't being met, some need isn't being met because of a commitment I have. And that shifted it dramatically and gave me a lot more ability to be in a place when I met Yvonne to shift my life dramatically. But I still wrestle with it. And finding people that I can work with around owning my shadow and being vulnerable, that's an ongoing work. And that's what Susan does with her honesty salons. So it's a never-ending process, far from complete.
Right in the corner there.
Way back there, yeah.
Yeah, back here. I have a folder way back there. I read your little book you left us on the environment, that pretty little fold-out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, when did you write that?
That was 93.
Yeah.
Actually 91.
How much farther than when you wrote it? We haven't, I mean, we're still in a big, do you have any ideas on where we go from here in the environment? Or it seemed to concern you then. And
it still does.
From Marin Valley or anything?
Yeah. You know, think locally, act globally, or what, the other way around. Think globally, act locally. And it's depressing, and I have to continually reframe the news that I generally get it through Colbert, so there's some humor about it. But it's not fun. And yes, doing our bit about it, and it's huge. Any other questions? Looks like.
I have a comment about
Yeah.
that little book. It's, if you guys haven't read it, read it. It's very good. It's very, you know, kind of programmatic way of kind of just parsing it all out. And, you know, those are questions, if you answer them honestly, I think most people could probably find that we could all do better than we're doing, even though we're sort of trying, but, you know.
How many of you know what she's talking about, the little book? They were out on the counter here. How many of you don't? Okay, we found another box of them last week, so I can bring some more over. It's called the Global Wellness Inventory. It was actually my wife's idea.
I read the whole thing in a couple hours.
Yeah, it's a questionnaire. If you leave that out for people to look at.
Library?
Are you done with it?
Is there one in the library? I'm not sure. I can put one in the library. I do have one extra here. The box is over in Oakland. We found it in the basement of a friend's house.
Wow.
But what we did was take the wellness inventory for your personal health and convert it to the planet's health based on individual behaviors. So that's what the 120 questions are. Okay, well I think that's it. Oh, one more?
So a lot of the people like Abraham talked about what you focus on, you keep going. So how do you focus on your shadow and do the shadow work without enlarging it so much you get overwhelmed by it? Do you have, or are you still trying to figure that out?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. You have to realize that my shadow is everything I think I'm not. And by definition, I don't know what it is, except as it shows up in relationships. And when I'm pissed off at somebody, it's usually something in me that I'm not owning that I'm projecting onto them. And so they're a mirror to reflect to me something I need to look at. And if I look at it with the intent to grow and to be conscious, to eat my shadow is the term that Robert Bly uses, then I come out feeling closer to them and to the whole situation. So it's a double-edged sword, but good question. So
Forgiveness.
yeah, forgiving yourself is really what it's about. You really can't forgive anyone else.